What will be heard below is not a heretical view. It is the closest version to the truth. On one side is Homer. But the war that Homer describes is not a historical event, but a myth. It is generally accepted that the core of any myth contains a hidden truth. But the description of the real achievements of the heroes is made through imaginary interventions of the gods. On the other hand, there are official documents. They come from the opponents of the Greeks in Asia Minor at the time described by Homer, the Hittites. Around 1500 BC, there were four great empires in the eastern Mediterranean and the Middle East. These were the Hittites, the Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Ahiyavas. Scholars have identified the Ahiyavas, which are referred to Hittite texts, with the Mycenaean Greeks of the Late Bronze Age, those that Homer calls Achaeans. The Greek script of that time was the so-called Linear B. However, the texts of this first Greek writing are purely administrative and accounting. In the Linear B tablets, there are no references to diplomatic contacts with foreign rulers. Thus, in fact, they do not give information about the way of governing the Mycenaean world. But in Hattusa, the capital of the Hittite Empire, it was discovered in 1906 an archive of 10,000 of clay tablets relating to the administration as well as their relations with other countries, something like foreign ministry documents. The texts of these tablets include mainly chronicles and letters. From these, it appears that there were close diplomatic contacts of the Hittites with the powerful kingdoms of the time. The correspondence in about 30 of these texts concerns Hittite contacts with Achiyava. These texts have been called Achiyava texts, and show that there have been 220 years of contacts between these two kingdoms. It is revealed that many generations of Greeks and Hittites, from 1430 to 1210 BC, were in conflict in Western Asia Minor. The closest information we have about the Trojan War is found in these texts. The decipherment of the Hittite tablets proves that a Trojan War really took place, but the facts seem to have been completely reversed in relation to what Homer writes. Some names and place names in Hittite texts have been identified, some with a question mark. The identification of the names, perhaps, highlights the historical background of the Homeric epics.
The names which have been identified, even with a question mark, are Ahiyava, Achaia, that is Greece, Alicia, Cyprus, Wilusa, Ilios, Terusa, Troy, Laspas, Lesphos, Atarisia, Atreus, Kagamina,
Agamemnon,
Tawagalawas,
Eteocles,
Alexandus,
Alexander,
Mulayara,
Menelaus,
Payamaradu,
Priam,
Apollonius, Apollo.
After 1500 BC, a confederation of 22 states of Western Asia Minor, called a Suba, was formed to oppose the rising Hittite Empire. Among the member states of Asuba were Taruisa, the Trojan Peninsula, and Velosa Aurelian, the city of Troy. Here we must mention that the name Asia came from the word Asuba. And now the story. According to Hittite texts, around 1430 BC, a king of the Achaeans called Agamemnon married a princess of Asuba. Part of the dowry he took were some islands in the northeastern Aegean. Perhaps Tenedos, Imbros, Lemnos, and Lesbos. But in reality, he never got this dowry, because a little later the Hittites conquered and incorporated Asuba into their state, along with the dowry. A few years later, a ruler king of northwestern Anatolia, called Majavada, apparently a vassal of the Hittites, was attacked by King Atrus of Ahiyava. Atrus attacked western Anatolia, east of the island of Lesbos. King Tundalias of the Hittites came to the rescue and repulsed the Achaeans. After rescuing Majavada, he instructed him to rule the territory of western Anatolia, just east of Lesbos, demanding that he swear allegiance. Atrus, however, campaigned again against Majavada, having 100 chariots and several thousand infantries. Majavada again asked for the intervention of Tundalias, who saved him for a second time. Around 1390 BC, the next Hittite king, Arnavatas, son of Tundalias, in a letter, accuses Majavada of collaborating with the Achaeans when they invaded Cyprus, which belonged to the Hittites. The text also mentions the name of the messenger of Atrus to Majavada, who was probably called Menelaus. A century later, around the beginning of the 13th century BC, Hittite relations with the Egyptians deteriorated rapidly. For this reason, the Hittites are trying to secure their backs, and to throw the burden on the Egyptians. So, they turn to the west, and sign a peace treaty with Troy, around 1280 BC. The king of Troy was called Alexander, a name that was Greek. Alexander signed the treaty with the Hittite king Muvatalus. One of the three gods, whom Alexander invokes as the guarantor of the terms of the treaty, is Apollonius, probably the Greek Apollo. In the Iliad, also, Apollo is presented as the supreme god of the Trojans, and the one who helped Paris Alexander to kill Achilles. At the same time, shortly after 1295 BC, an Achaean king wrote a letter to the Hittite king Muvatalus. The Greek king claims the islands that were given as a dowry to his great-grandfather, King Agamemnon, by the governor of Asuba. As we have said, at the time of the letter, the Hittites turned their attention to the Egyptians, with whom they finally clashed in the famous Battle of Kadesh in 1274 BC. Thus, despite some lukewarm objections, and in order to secure their backs, they do not question the Greek claim. The weakening of the Hittites causes them to fold from Western Asia Minor, and gives space to the Achaeans, who already control Miletus. Around 1250 BC, the leader of the Achaeans in Miletus is Eteocles, the brother of the king of the Achaeans. Etiocle supports an uprising by the Hittite vassals in Western Asia Minor, backing in revolutionary prince Priam. The Hittite texts state that Priam achieved significant military successes, and reached as far north as Troy, from where he expelled King Alexander. At the same time, that is around 1250 BC, the Hittite king Hattusilus addressed a letter to the king of the Achaeans. In his letter, he expresses his concern about Priam's activities against the Hittites, and demands his extradition. But he tries to appease the Greeks with polite rhetoric. In this text, it is mentioned that once Greeks and Hittites were involved in hostilities in the territory of Troy, which have now been resolved amicably. Hattusilus also complains that the Achaeans abducted 7,000 of his slaves. A confirmation of this claim comes from Pilus. On Linear B tablets found there, female slaves are mentioned, which have not Greek names, but Anatolian. They worked as weavers in the palace of the king of Pilus. Conclusion. All the Hittite texts about the Achaeans are very informative and interesting, but they do not contain clear evidence that the Greeks fought in Troy. A conflict apparently took place in 1250 BC between Alexander, king of Troy, and Priam, supported by the Greeks. 70 years later, in 1180 BC, a complete destruction of the city occurred, possibly by the invasion of the peoples of the sea. It is believed that among the so-called sea peoples there were Achaeans from the Mycenaean kingdoms who had collapsed. This constant movement, caused by the sea peoples, is probably described by Homer with the mobility of the heroes of the Trojan War. It is obvious that the war that Homer describes is not a historical event, but it is not a fictional story either. Probably Homer took facts from the collective memory of 250 years of history from the distant past, and attributed them to a 10-year war. That is, his myth has as its core the real events, which refer to the dialogues of the kings of the two great powers of the time.